Okay, I'm going now over to Richard.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Okay, can I just ask, is Arthur Torrington in the room? No, okay. And we're expecting Diane Holland and John McDonald to come from meetings that they're at, so I'll go next. Okay, well, why did we choose war and impairment? Well, because really the focus on the media, perhaps too much for most people, has been nothing but the First World War for about 6 months. And it's likely to be for the next 3.5 years. So perhaps we need a slightly different angle on it. And so rather than, as Sean said, just thinking of the dead, perhaps we should think of the living who came back, but who were massively impaired, and whether the society that they came back for, which they'd made, whatever one thinks of why the war was fought, they'd made that sacrifice, but did the society meet its debt to them? Well, on the home front, interestingly, big social changes took place. Disabled people who couldn't get any work before the war. The first picture up here shows a whole group of about 15 deaf men in a factory in Enfield working in a shell factory. They were the lucky ones, they got to work. It has to be said that many deaf people were shot in the streets of this country because they didn't answer a challenge from a sentry. But these were the lucky ones who got to a factory and worked. Of course, when everybody came back in 1919, they got their cards. The same was also true for women. And many women moved up the hierarchy. So there was a hospital in London where all the doctors were women. This is unheard of before the war. There were many women on the shop floor, something like 6 million women recruited into the massive industrialised war drive, which made this war unlike any other that had been fought to date, because it was entirely dependent on how much machines, ammunition, vehicles and armaments could be manufactured by each side and then thrown against the frozen trenches for the 52 months that the war in Europe raged. 5,000 soldiers a day died on average, and if we take that figure of 2.5 million, it means that there was something like 12,000 soldiers every day who sustained an injury which would affect them for the rest of their life as an impairment. That is a staggering figure. But was the society ready for it? Not really. The first industrial war wasn't counting casualties. 60,000 which were killed in one day on the Battle of the Somme was seen by Kitchener as acceptable casualties. Shrapnel, machine guns, gas brought high casualties and deadlock. These had not been used before in a mass sense. Machine guns had been used, but only in sustaining the empire against non-Europeans. It wasn't thought right that we should use machine guns. That all went out the window when total war arrived. The people who were in command, particularly of the British Army, were cavalry officers, yet the cavalry played hardly any part after the first 3 months in this war because it got bogged down in trenches. So they didn't really know what to do. But at the end of it, there were 16 million dead, some people say more, and 20 million disabled people. So what was the response? Well, medicine, obviously, in a crisis improved, like most technology. And if you look at this slide, which I'll explain to people, there were, in the US Civil War, just on the Union side, there were 364,000 killed, 281,000 wounded. A percentage injury to death of 56%. Not very good. It was the first war where there were organised ambulances, but by the First World War, the ratio had come down to 36%. Even though many of those 36% who sustained injuries and didn't die initially did die of gangrene and other untreated wounds, because on average it took 24 hours to get to a field hospital from when you sustained your injury, if you were lucky. By the Second World War, we had 405,000 service people killed, many, many more civilians. It's the first war where civilians outnumbered fighting forces, and 671 with disabled from it. So that's 37%. Not much improvement, though there was massive improvement in antibiotics and other methods that were being used. By the Korean War, it had come down to 26% of those who were killed, a much larger number. And you might remember the series MASH with the field hospital, where on a helicopter they could get people on the operating theatre within 40 minutes of them being injured. So that made a huge difference, and it meant many more people survived. And so we see the same thing happening in Vietnam, about the level of in Korea. But in the last 3 wars that the Americans have fought, these are American figures, it's come down from 13% in the first Gulf War to, in Afghanistan, only 8%. Now what does that mean? It means, and the figures are similar for the British Army, that there were 400 killed in Afghanistan, but it means that at 8% there was something like 6,000 who actually have sustained lifelong impairment. And we've seen some of that in what's been said by veterans. Now what was the British response after the First World War? Well, after the jubilation of the Victory Day, of course there were thousands and thousands of men in their special blue uniforms in hospitals all over the country, many of whom stayed there for a dozen years. There were injuries that had never been seen before, such as people's faces half blown away and there had to be plastic surgery. There were many thousands recognised with shell shock and many thousands more without, who were not recognised, urethemia. And there wasn't much else apart from this medical help and care. Now, after much pressure, the King himself started a voluntary fund to get people enrolled in work, the King's National Roll. This was quite successful, though many government departments did not take many people on. But it was voluntary, and of course the employers chose the people with the lowest level of impairment. So those with severe impairment never really got a chance at employment. The government relied on charity, and after agitation, 1 minute, all right, I'll speed on. The government relied on charity, and charities like St Dunstan's and Queen Mary's were set up. But these only were set up, and the British Legion itself formed in 1921 after the failure of the right to work and the failure of direct action by, for instance, organisations such as the Soldiers and Sailors Federation, discharged soldiers and sailors, who did some direct action. But by 1920, for some reason, that had gone. In Germany and other places, it didn't go. That militancy continued, and as a result, they got a much better deal. And it should be noted here that many of the soldiers who fought, including on the Western Front, came from Greater India, who sustained 47,000 dead and 65,000 wounded. In Africa, 500,000, 71,000 dead and 100,000 wounded. We never hear about what happened to those people in terms of pensions. After much agitation, from 1916, when we went from volunteers to conscription, they brought in a pension for dependents after someone was killed. But it was 1921 before a disability pension was brought in, and that was so strictly administered that many, many thousands didn't meet the grade and didn't get a pension. In fact, by the end of the 1920s, someone, Viscount Castlerose, who was a veteran from the Guards and an officer, he wrote in the Sunday Express, "We have never demanded our rights. The Americans, who never went through anything like we did, are on a much better basis. Instead of demanding our rights, we went hat in hand asking for charity. We should have gone with a bayonet in our hand." And that was really what happened in Weimar Germany, where there was a much more, even though they were the defeated power, there was a much more healthy, from the left-wing socialist government that was brought in to stop the revolutions that were happening in 1919. They created a much better system, and particularly the Severe Disablement Act, which meant that people with severe loss of limbs and other issues were actually had a pension. I will start to one. Right. And Hitler then turned this to his advantage, recruiting to the Nazi Party many disabled veterans who felt annoyed about what was going on, but then turned round once war started to kill many of them. What were the lessons learned? Well, I think some other speakers will talk more about this, but when Nye Bevan came to set up, following the Tomlinson report, rehabilitation and resettlement of disabled people, he decided that there must be state provision, it shouldn't rely on charity, that this shouldn't just apply to war veterans but all disabled people, and from that we got the 1944 Disabled Persons Act, access to work, resettlement officers, re-employ, and most of the changes that we have in the welfare state. That is now under threat. Last slide. What can you do to help Disability History Month? Well, we're starting early this year. There are already 16 events around the country, 6 exhibitions running. You can distribute the broadsheet. We've got lots here for people to take away. Come to the seminar on the 6th of December. Get local research about your families and find out what happened. Send it to us. We'll put it on the website. We've also been involved with Anti-Bullying Week this week, and there are materials on the table. And next year, start thinking ahead for that. The theme is media and moving image, how things have changed in the last 110 years. So we've got a lot on our plate, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you very much.